To maintain proper hydration, water intake must be balanced with water output. Water comes into our body largely in the form of liquids. About 60% of the water that comes into our body comes in a liquid form. But another 30% comes in as our solid foods. If you're eating lots of fruits and vegetables, you're taking in a large amount of water with those foods. But we also wind up producing about 10% of our body's water content through metabolism, like cellular respiration. We're also constantly losing water. About 4% of that water leaves our body with feces. Another 8% leaves with sweat. 28% or so leaves the body as our insensible water loss. This is water that's evaporating off the surface of your lungs as you respire, and there's nothing we can do to stop that. And 60% or so leaves our body in the form of urine. Healthy people need to tightly regulate the osmolality of their body fluids, meaning the concentration of solutes that are dissolved in the water of their body. This osmolality should not vary much outside of the range of about 280 to 300. If osmolality increases, if the concentration of salts in our blood or body fluids increases, it triggers the thirst response and a release of ADH. If osmolality decreases, if we have too little salt or too much water, it inhibits ADH release, which leads to water loss from the body. These mechanisms, thirst and ADH, control water levels directly. But we can also adjust fluid levels in the body by adjusting sodium levels, with the resulting effects on water. If we retain sodium, we're going to retain more water. If we excrete sodium, we're going to excrete that water as well. The thirst mechanism is the major driving force for water intake, and it's governed by the hypothalamus's thirst center. This thirst center in the hypothalamus is triggered by osmoreceptors that respond to changes in the stretch from water gain or water loss, as well as baroreceptors that respond to decreases in blood pressure caused by loss of volume. In addition to these mechanisms coming from the thirst center of the hypothalamus, dry mouth is also a mechanism that drives us to drink. Dry mouth is caused by osmotic pressures drawing water away from the salivary glands. If the osmolality of our blood starts to increase, if there's too much salt or too little water in our blood, it causes an osmotic pressure that pulls water back towards the blood, away from the salivary glands, reducing the output of saliva, drying the mouth, and driving us to drink. When we do take that drink, drinking water satiates our thirst before that water is actually even added to the volume of blood traveling through circulation. This is because as we drink that water, the water moistens osmoreceptors in the throat and mouth, and triggers stretch receptors in the stomach and intestines before we even absorb that water into the bloodstream. These receptors send signals that inhibit the thirst center of the hypothalamus. We constantly lose water through our insensible water loss at the lungs. We said that's about 28% of our water loss, as part of our feces, and as our sensible water loss at the kidneys for excretion. We said that this was about 60% of our water loss and equals roughly 500 milliliters of fluid each day. Low blood osmolality, caused by too much water or too little salt, inhibits ADH release. Because ADH is antidiuretic, when we inhibit its release, that acts as a diuretic. This leads to increased urination and water loss. As we lose that water, it changes the concentration of our blood to bring that osmolality back up again. Release of ADH is normally controlled by changes in extracellular fluid osmolality. An increase in ECF osmolality, that means too much salt in the blood or too little water, causes the release of ADH. ADH release leads to the insertion of extra aquaporins in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct of the renal tubes. That causes an extra amount of water to be retained, which dilutes out the blood and increases blood pressure and returns our osmolality to normal. It was high osmolality because we had too much salt or too little water, so here we retained water to decrease that osmolality. An abnormal decrease in ECF osmolality, that is, too much water or too little salt, can inhibit ADH release. This leads to fewer aquaporins being available, which means we're going to reabsorb less water. We're going to produce more urine, and by doing so, we're also going to wind up decreasing blood pressure. ADH can also be released in response to a large decrease in blood volume or pressure. Its number one trigger is this change in osmolality, but if there is a large decrease in blood volume or pressure, that can also cause a release of ADH.